Do handguards on swords always mean what we think they mean? Hi mates, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and I understand that's a somewhat cryptic way to open this video, but I was looking at this French Cutlass, which is part of my stock for Easton Antique Arms, and I was considering why the French have a fully enclosed guard on one side of the guard here, fully enclosed half basket you could almost say, compared to the British cutlasses of the time, which essentially have more like a sabre guard that guard the top and the front. So why did the French think it was so important to have an enclosed guard? But moreover, actually if you look at a British sabre cutlass guard, then it is pretty damned enclosed, certainly more enclosed than lots of other swords of the period and of course that went earlier. And I thought, is this to do with cutlasses being used on board ships in very enclosed and cramped conditions, and when they're fighting, that's one of the reasons presumably that they preferred shorter blades for using in cramped conditions and easier to carry, easier to store on board a ship and use on board a ship when you've got masts and rigging and everything all around you. A short blade seems practical and useful. Is that connected to why they had really protective guards on them? And I think fundamentally the answer is yes. However, if we extrapolate that conclusion to all swords, or at least most swords, does that conclusion still stand up? Well, let's have a think here. Let's look at the basket-hilted Highland or British broadsword or backsword. Okay, why were basket hilts, fully enclosed basket hilts, so popular in the British Isles between the 16th and the 18th centuries? Is it anything to do with fighting in particularly cramped, closed-in conditions? I don't know. I do think it's funny to consider that one of the earliest definitely dateable basket hilts we have from Britain is from the Mary Rose, which sunk in 1545, and that's a basket hilt and it's a ship. So we've just been talking about ships' cutlasses, and there we've got a basket hilt, a very early fully formed basket hilt found on a ship. So could it be that in the Elizabethan age, all of these basket hilts had a greater tendency to be found in naval applications and maybe not so much in land wars? Well, I don't think that's the case. And in fact, we know that basket hilts were very popular in Scotland, used on land by Highlanders, most famously, later on in the 17th and 18th century. But we also know that basket-hilted swords were extremely popular in England as well, used by soldiers on foot and cavalry on horseback. So fundamentally, we could just say, well, basket hilts were popular because they provided a lot of hand protection. But lots of other people at this time were not using them. And this is another important point I want you to go away with, is that we don't simply see a evolution from no handguards in the ancient era to a bit of handguards, cross guards in the medieval period, to slightly more developed hilts in the Renaissance, and then magically everyone's using basket hilts in the industrial age. It just doesn't go like that. The fact is that yes, indeed, more complex hilts were developed in the Renaissance and they continued in use to the 19th and 20th centuries. However, not everybody used them. So this here is for a sailor, a French sailor in this case, and this is a cutlass, and this has, you'll notice, a fairly short blade like a shortened sabre and a form of basket hilt. But if we swap over to another French sword here, a briquette, actually not with a typical blade, but we'll talk about that another time maybe, you'll see that this has a fairly minimal guard. It just has a knuckle bow. And in fact, French infantry in the 18th century, whereas the sailors often carried cutlasses with big hand guards, the infantry often simply had a little knuckle bow. Well, they're fighting on foot, they're not fighting on a ship, but it is nevertheless, in terms of the blade, pretty much the same kind of sword, same size, same weight, used in pretty much the same way. So why did they not get a form of basket hilt? Well, one answer, of course, is carriage and wearing. The fact is that infantry soldiers, and in fact artillery later on, this is an artillery one probably, artillery carried these on their side all the time, and it wasn't their principal weapon. So their primary weapon was a firearm, or perhaps if they're in artillery, they're manning a gun, a cannon, and so this is just a backup. Whereas the cutlass can afford to have a whopping great hilt and be fairly heavy because you don't walk around with it all the time because you're on board a ship and the ship carries the cutlass. When you need it, you go and get it from a rack. So that's one explanation. But then we also find, if we look at cavalry swords, there's a tendency. Heavy cavalry tend to have a bigger, more enclosed hilts than light cavalry. I picked here a sort of the perfect example of a light cavalry sword, although these were often used on foot as well, and that is the Ottoman Turkish pala. And the pala has a simple crossguard. Now at this time the Ottoman Turks did have forms of sabre guard. They did have forms of more protective hilt than this, but partly for traditional cultural reasons and perhaps other practical reasons, they did sometimes retain just a simple crossguard. And in fact, the yataghan, which was a very popular sword for their infantry, had no guard at all, really. So they didn't consider guards important. So is the answer shields? A lot of people would look at Turkish or Indian or Persian swords and they would say, well, these are all cultures that use shields. And yes, I think that's part of it as well. If you come from a culture where a buckler or shield of some size is going to be often used with a sword, then an enclosed guard isn't that important on the sword because your shield or buckler protects the line to the hand a lot of the time. So I think what we're starting to unpack here is that the reasons are complex. If we go back to cavalry swords for a second, so in Europe it was traditional for light cavalry, that is fast moving, skirmishing, usually on smaller, faster horses, to have, you know, hussars and light dragoons, people like this, to have a sword which had either a simple crossguard or a simple knuckle bow, sometimes with some outer branches on it, but by and large a relatively light and not that protective hilt. Because of course, how do light cavalry operate? They're hit and run. You ride in, you attack the enemy, you ride out. If they clash with other cavalry, you're passing each other at speed, so you're not standing there duking it out. Whereas heavy cavalry, who had more protective guards, were more likely to amble in, get into a melee, a kind of turning melee, or get into the kind of just a thick mass of men and horses and hack it out. So for them, a basket-hilted broadsword or backsword or a palash is a more appropriate type of sword. So I think what we're seeing here is that certain types of usage of swords do encourage basket hilts or more complex hand protection, so long as it is not an inconvenience to have it. Okay, so there's layers to this. So whether we're looking at types of sabre, whether we're looking at types of rapier and broadsword and backsword, when we see a sword like a schiavona and then we compare it to a swept hilt rapier, you have to consider not only the use of those types of swords, a more cutting sword versus a more thrusting sword, but also you have to consider who is using those swords and in what particular contexts. Okay, so the cavalry one is quite easy to look at. In some ways you could say the naval one is quite easy to look at. When you're looking at foot soldiers, it's a little bit different. And so answering the question of why did Highlanders like basket hilts so much, let's say in, you know, the 1600s and 1700s, why did the Scottish love a basket hilt when the Italians, for example, tended to go with something more minimal than that? That's a great question, because those are people fighting on foot, they're not on horseback, they're not on ships, and they're often using targes or shields. Admittedly, they did sometimes use the swords by themselves. So, I'm interested to hear your thoughts and expansions on this topic. It's a very big topic and therefore I've not gone in depth in any particular one of those examples. But just thinking broadly about it, why do you think naval sailors, essentially, and occasionally Marines, used really usually quite protective and big hilts, whereas infantry and light cavalry used minimalist hilts? Why did some nations stick with very basic and minimalist guards when new technology was available? Why didn't they move to those more complex guards? Do you agree with my assertions about light cavalry versus heavy cavalry and the hilts that they choose? I think that that's fairly well evidenced. And lastly, why did the Venetians, for example, love the Schiavona basket hilt? Why did the Scottish Highlanders love the basket hilt? And why did certain other nations not? Why did they prefer much more minimalist hilts? Was it purely a comfort of wearing, or were there other considerations in here? I hope that will get your little grey cells working. I'm looking forward to seeing the comments down below, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.